The rope was too tight, and she wasn't going to tell him that. Elias Cobb crouched by the dead fire pit, watching the woman he'd caught 2 hours before test the give in her bindings without once looking down at her own wrists. Her eyes stayed on him. Black hair, cut short at one side. Morning cut, he guessed, though he didn't know for what, and a face that gave him nothing. Not fear. Not hate, even though she had reason enough for both. "You understand me?" he said. She said nothing. "I asked the marshal for a tracker. He sent me a prisoner instead." Elias spat into the ash. "Bounty's on a man, not a woman. I don't get paid for you. Then let me go." Her English came out flat and unhurried, like she'd decided the words were worth the effort and no more. "You keep me, you slow yourself down. You want the man I was with. He is 3 valleys west by now. You were with him. I was following him. Not the same thing." Elias had been chasing Whitlock Reyes for 11 days. Ever since the man put 2 bullets in a rancher outside Tucson and rode north with a saddlebag of stolen army pay. He'd cut this woman's trail an hour behind Reyes's, at a spring that shouldn't have had 2 sets of tracks converging on it by accident. He'd made his decision fast, the way he made most decisions, rope first, questions in the saddle. Now, looking at her, he wondered if he'd made a mistake he couldn't afford. "Name," he said. "Nail. That means something? Everything means something to somebody." She shifted her weight, testing the ache in her shoulders. "You are hunting the wrong way, Hunter. He knows this land. You do not. I can see it in how you sit your horse, like the ground might change its mind about holding you up." Elias didn't answer that because she wasn't wrong, and he'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to look like a fool was to argue with the truth. He was 3 days out from any town he knew, chasing a killer through country that didn't appear on any map he trusted, with a canteen going shallow and a horse that had started favoring its left foreleg that morning in a way he didn't like. He'd told himself the bounty was worth it. $300 would buy back the debt on his father's land. The debt that had been sitting on him like a stone in his boot for 4 years. He hadn't told himself what he'd do if the mountains ate him before he collected it. "Why were you following him?" Elias said, "if not to warn somebody or rob him yourself?" Something moved behind her eyes then, the first crack in the flat calm. "He killed my brother's son, 11 years old. Because the boy startled his horse and he did not like being startled." Her jaw set. "I do not care about your bounty, Hunter. I care that I am closer to him than you will ever be, and you have tied my hands." Elias sat with that a long moment, the fire long dead between them, the wind picking up dust off the flat behind him and dragging it across his boots. Somewhere off to the north, a coyote called and got no answer. "If I cut you loose," he said slowly, "you run. Or you put a knife in me first chance you get." "If you keep me tied," she said, "you will die in these mountains not knowing which spring holds water and which one will make your horse sick. And Reyes will spend that army money in some cantina 300 miles from anyone who cares that a boy is dead." It wasn't a threat. It was arithmetic laid out plain, and that was somehow worse. He didn't sleep well that night, aware of her breathing 8 feet away, aware of the knife on his belt and the fact that his hands, for the first time since Tucson, didn't feel entirely steady around it. By morning his horse could barely bear weight on the bad leg. He stood in the gray light running his palm down the swollen fetlock and understood, with the particular sickness of a man watching a plan die in front of him, that he was now on foot in unfamiliar country, 80 miles from the nearest outpost, with a killer somewhere ahead of him and no earthly idea which direction to walk. Nail watched him work it out. She didn't gloat. That, more than anything, was what made him finally reach for his knife and cut the rope. "You point me toward water," he said, throat tight around the words, "and I'll cut you loose the moment we're square. That's the trade." She rubbed her wrists unhurried and looked past him at the mountains going gold with first light mountains that he was beginning to understand. She read the way he read a printed page. "That is not a trade," she said. "That is a debt, and you have no idea yet how large it will get." She turned and started walking, not waiting to see if he'd follow. He followed. The water she found him wasn't on any map. A seep behind a slab of red rock, hidden in a fold of land he'd have walked past 3 times without seeing it. He filled his canteen with hands that shook slightly from 3 days of rationing, and didn't thank her, because some part of him was still working out how a man thanked someone he'd had tied to a tree the night before. "Your horse," Nail said, crouched beside the limping animal, running careful fingers along its foreleg. "Not broken, strained, and something in the hoof. A stone, maybe, gone deep." She looked up at him. "He can carry you 2 more days if you are careful. Less if you are not. You know horses. I know that a man who does not know his own horse should not be hunting anyone." Elias felt the barb land and didn't argue it. He watched her work the hoof loose with a sliver of bone she'd had hidden somewhere in her clothes. A tool he hadn't found when he searched her, and the realization of that sat uneasily alongside a grudging respect he didn't want to feel yet. "Why are you helping me," he said, "when you could have walked off back there and left me for the buzzards?" "Because you would have died before you found him, and I need him found." She didn't look up from the hoof. "That is not help. That is using you as a tool, same as you tried to use me as one. We are not so different this morning as you would like to think, Hunter." That stung more than it should have. They made 3 miles before noon, Elias leading the horse now instead of riding it. Nail setting a pace that read the land ahead of them like she already knew every stone in it. Twice she stopped him with a raised hand before he'd have walked into open ground a rifle could cover from the ridge above. The second time, she pointed without a word to a thread of smoke rising pale against the sky, 2 miles off and downwind. "Reyes?" Elias breathed. "Perhaps. Or Comanchero. Or someone who will kill us both for the horse and not care whose bounty either of us is chasing." She crouched low, studying the smoke's rhythm, thick, then thin, then thick again. "Someone is cooking, not signaling. That is something. How do you know the difference?" "The same way you would know the difference between a man loading a rifle and a man cleaning one, if you had grown up watching it." There was no cruelty in how she said it, only the plain fact of it, and somehow that made it land harder. They circled wide, and it cost them 2 hours, and Elias spent every minute of it turning over what she'd said the night before. "That is a debt, and you have no idea yet how large it will get," and wondering when the bill was going to come due. Came due at dusk. They'd stopped in a hollow to let the horse rest when 3 riders came over the rise to the east, moving unhurried, the way men move when they believe the land already belongs to them. Elias recognized the lead rider's coat before he recognized his face. Whitlock Reyes didn't travel alone anymore. He'd picked up company somewhere. 2 men with the particular loose-jointed meanness of hired guns who'd stopped asking what the job was as long as it paid. "Down," Nail hissed, and had him flat behind the rock before he'd finished processing the sight of his bounty riding straight toward them. They lay pressed into the dirt as the riders passed 40 yards off, close enough that Elias could hear Reyes laugh at something, a short, ugly bark of a sound, and close enough that he felt Nail go rigid beside him at the sound of it. Recognizing, he understood, the voice of the man who'd killed her brother's son. Her hand found the knife at his belt before he registered she'd moved. "No," he breathed, catching her wrist. 3 of them. "We go now, we're both dead." And Reyes rides off clean. "That's not justice. That's just 2 more bodies in these hills nobody finds." She held still under his grip, and for a long moment he thought she'd fight him for it. Then, slow, she let the knife settle back against his belt, and something in her shoulders came down 1/2 an inch. "You are learning," she said quietly, not looking at him. "That is the first useful thing you have done since I met you." "High praise. I do not give false praise. It wastes both our time." She watched the riders shrink toward the smoke they'd circled around earlier. Toward, Elias now understood. A camp that was Reyes's, not some stranger's. They will camp there tonight. Tomorrow, if we are careful and you do exactly as I tell you, we take him before he wakes. "We?" She looked at him then, and for the first time since the spring, there was something almost like the ghost of understanding passing between them. 2 people who'd started the day as captor and captive and ended it, however uneasily, as something closer to partners. "You needed a tracker," she said. "I needed a man willing to carry a rope for reasons other than his own money. It seems, Hunter, we have found what we each needed. Whether either of us survives to collect it is a different question." Overhead, the first stars were coming out hard and close, the way they only did in country this empty, and somewhere behind them the horse shifted its weight and let out a long, tired breath, and Elias Cobb lay in the dirt beside a woman he'd tied to a tree less than a day before, and understood that everything about this hunt had changed. They moved before first light, leaving the horse hobbled in a stand of juniper a half-mile back. Nail's decision, made without discussion, the kind of decision Elias was starting to understand she simply made and expected him to keep pace with. "He will hear a horse before he hears us," she said. "Feet are quieter if you know how to place them." He didn't, not the way she did. She moved across broken ground like the ground had agreed in advance not to betray her, while every third step he took found a loose stone or a dry branch, and each time her hand came back without looking, 2 fingers pressed flat against his chest. Wait, until whatever sound he'd made finished dying into the dark. The camp, when they reached it, was 3 shapes around a bed of coals gone to orange embers. The horses picketed loose in a rope corral 20 yards off. Reyes slept nearest the fire, saddlebag under his head like a man who trusted no one, not even his own hired guns, to leave it be overnight. "The money is under him," Nail breathed, barely sound at all. "You want him alive, for your bounty." "I want—" She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. "Alive," Elias said. "For both of us. Dead men don't answer for what they did. I've seen enough of that to know it doesn't fill the hole it's supposed to fill." Her jaw tightened, and for a long 3 seconds he thought she'd walk into that camp and do what she'd come to do regardless of what he said. Rope or no rope, bounty or no bounty. Then something in her seemed to settle, some decision made in a place he couldn't see into. "Alive," she said. "But if he reaches for a gun, Hunter, I will not be the one who hesitates." They came at the camp from opposite sides, the plan hers, laid out in 4 whispered sentences that Elias followed with a trust that surprised him. Trust in a woman he'd had bound and gagged less than 2 days prior, trust that had grown out of a hoof pulled clean of a stone and a hand held flat against his chest in the dark. It went wrong in the way these things always go wrong, not in the plan but in a half-second nobody could have accounted for. One of the hired guns woke early, some animal instinct pulling him up out of sleep with his hand already closing on his rifle, and the quiet of the ambush broke apart into shouting and the scrape of steel and a shot that went wide into the dark and set every horse in the rope corral screaming. Elias hit Reyes low, both of them going down hard into the cold fire pit, ash and embers scattering. Reyes's hand clawing for the pistol at his hip even as Elias's weight came down on his wrist. Somewhere behind him he heard the second gunman's boots pounding toward the fight, heard Nail's voice cut across the chaos in a language he didn't know, sharp as a blade, and heard the gunman's charge break into a stumble and then a fall. Reyes was strong, wiry strong, prison yard strong, and he got a boot into Elias's ribs that emptied his lungs and nearly broke his grip. For one long, terrible second Elias was on his back with Reyes's pistol swinging toward his face and no strength left to stop it. And then Reyes screamed, a short animal sound, and the pistol fell into the ash. And Nail was standing over both of them with a knife slick to the hilt and Reyes's forearm laid open from wrist to elbow. "Alive," she said, breathing hard, looking down at Elias with something fierce and unreadable in her face. As promised, by the time the sky had gone gray at the edges, it was over. The first hired gun lay groaning with a dislocated shoulder where Nail had thrown him into a boulder. The second had run for the horses and kept running, and Elias let him go. One less man to guard on the ride back was worth more than the satisfaction of catching him. Reyes sat against a rock with his arm bound tight in a strip torn from his own shirt, cursing steadily under his breath. The saddlebag of army money recovered and sitting heavy at Elias's feet. Elias looked at Nail across the wreckage of the camp. Ash in her hair, blood on her hands that wasn't hers, and a stillness in her that hadn't been there the night before, like something long carried had finally been set down, even if it hadn't been carried all the way to where she'd wanted it to go. "You could have killed him," Elias said. "Nobody out here would have known different. I would have known." She wiped the knife clean against her leg, unhurried, the way she did everything. "My brother's son deserved better than to have his death answered with the same kind of killing that took him. He deserved a world where men like this one are made to answer, in daylight, before people who will remember his name when they say it." She looked at Reyes with something colder than hate. "You will see to that, Hunter. That was the price of my help. Not silver. Justice done right, in front of people who cannot look away from it." Elias looked down at the bag of army money, and then at Reyes and understood that the bounty he'd ridden 11 days to collect had never really been the point of this. Not anymore. "That's a debt I can carry," he said. They rested 2 days before the ride back. Elias's horse still favoring its leg, Reyes's wound needing time enough not to fester and rob a hangman's rope of its purpose. It was on the second night, with Reyes trussed and sullen by a fresh fire and the injured gunman set loose on foot with a warning rather than a bullet, that Nail finally sat down across from Elias instead of at the edge of the firelight where she'd kept herself since Tucson. "You did not ask me," she said, "why I was truly following him. Not just for my brother's son. Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to." She turned something over in her palm. A small carved token, would gone smooth with handling, shaped rough into the figure of a running horse. "My nephew carved this. The boy Reyes killed. He was not skilled with a knife yet. See, the legs are wrong, too short for the body." Her thumb moved over it like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "I have carried it 11 days because I could not decide if I wanted it to be evidence, or a keepsake. A hunter's reason or a mourner's. Can't it be both?" She looked up at him, and something in her face loosened, just slightly. The way ground loosens after a long-held frost finally breaks. "I did not expect a bounty hunter to ask a question like that. I didn't expect a woman I tied to a tree to save my life twice in 3 days." He turned his own scarred knuckles over in the firelight, an old habit from wounds that had healed wrong years back. "My father used to say a man's worth showing up in the moment nobody's watching to grade him for it. I've spent 4 years chasing bounties trying to pay off his debts and telling myself that was the same thing as honoring him. Watching you tonight, I don't know that it was. What was it, then? Fear, mostly. Fear dressed up as duty." He said it plainly, the way she said things, no dressing on it. "You don't strike me as a woman who runs from much. I have run from plenty. I have simply learned which things are worth stopping for." She closed her hand around the wooden horse. "This is one. My nephew's justice is another. I did not expect a third." She didn't finish the thought, and he didn't push her to. Some silences, he was learning from her, carried more truth than words could. "When this is done," he said instead, "when Reyes stands trial and the money's back with the army, what happens to you? Where do you go?" "Where I have always gone. Home, if it is still standing when I reach it. My people do not disappear simply because men like Reyes would prefer that we had." There was no bitterness in it, only fact, the same flat honesty she'd given him since the spring. "And you, Hunter? $300 and a debt paid on your father's land. Is that the whole of what you wanted from these 11 days? Elias thought about the ledger he'd carried in his head since Tucson, bounty, debt, land, done, and found, turning it over now that it had stopped adding up the way it used to. No, he admitted. Not anymore. Neither of them said what that meant. But when Nail banked the fire lower against the night wind, she settled herself an arm's length closer than she had any night before, and neither of them moved to change that, and somewhere out past the ridge a wolf called once into the dark and went unanswered, and the not answering felt, for the first time in a long while, like peace rather than absence. By morning, the cold had crept in enough that Reyes's teeth chattered against his cursing, and Elias's horse had finally stopped favoring the bad leg, and the long ride back toward anywhere that could be called civilization no longer felt, to either of them, like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of a different debt. One neither of them was in a hurry to see paid off and closed. The trial took place in a courthouse that smelled of new pine and old dust. For weeks after they rode into the outpost with Reyes bound across a spare horse and a saddlebag of recovered army pay that made the local marshal's eyebrows climb into his hat line, Elias testified. So did Nail, standing in a courtroom that had likely never before let a native woman speak from that particular spot. Her voice as flat and unhurried as it had been the night he first cut her free, laying out exactly what Whitlock Reyes had done to a boy who startled a horse he did not like being startled. Reyes was sentenced to hang, in daylight, in front of a crowd that would remember the boy's name when the judge read the charges aloud. The justice Nail had asked for at the cost of her help, delivered exactly as promised. Elias collected his bounty. He paid off his father's debt within the week. The stone he'd carried in his boot for 4 years finally set down on a clerk's desk in exchange for a signed release. He told himself, riding away from that office, that the ledger was closed now, everything squared, nothing left owing. He found Nail at the edge of town 2 days later, saddling a borrowed horse to ride home. The carved wooden token tied now on a leather cord around her neck instead of carried loose in her palm. "You're leaving," he said, and it came out heavier than he meant it to. I told you where I was going the first week we knew each other. She checked the cinch, unhurried as ever, though he noticed her hands weren't quite as steady as her voice. Some debts get paid and stay paid, Hunter. Others. She stopped and looked at him properly for the first time that morning. Others keep collecting interest, whether the two people owing them like it or not. Which kind is this? That depends entirely on whether you are fool enough to ride 200 miles out of your way to find out. He was already reaching for his own horse's reins before she'd finished the sentence. They didn't marry in any church, and no one back in Tucson would have recognized the small forge he built 2 years later at the crossing where the Old West Road met the river. A blacksmith's shop with a native woman's carved horse token nailed above the door beside a hunter's retired rope, coiled now and gathering dust instead of throats. Travelers passing through sometimes asked about the two names cut into the beam above the forge fire, side by side. No explanation offered and none needed by the two people who'd carved them there. Years later, when there was a daughter old enough to ask, Nail would tell her the story the way she told everything. Plain, unhurried, no dressing on the hard parts. About a bounty hunter who tied her to a tree and cut her loose within a day because he'd finally understood the difference between duty and fear. About a nephew's badly carved wooden horse that became, in time, not evidence and not only a keepsake, but a promise kept. About justice done in daylight where it could be remembered. And the rope? The girl would ask, pointing to the coil above the door. That, her mother would say, is what a debt looks like once it's finally paid. Not thrown away, but hung up where a person can still see it so they remember what it cost and what it bought instead. Outside, the river kept running the way it always had, indifferent and constant, past a forge with two names on the beam and a fire that never quite went cold.